Great. Welcome back to another episode of Firewall. As usual, I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. Co-host today, my friend Howard Wolfson, who I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with. And our guest today is Dr. Christina Greer, who is joining, I think, in this way, in this podcast, I'm saying this wrong, in her capacity as a juror on the Gotham Book Prize that Howard and I just created and announced. But because she would not be willing to sort of say all of these things about her bio, I'm going to do it for her because I think her modesty would cheat the audience. You're a professor at Fordham University of Political Science. You were the 2018 fellow for the McSilver Institute at NYU. You are the host of the podcast FAQ-NYC. You're the politics editor at thegrio.com. You're the producer and host of the Aftermath and The Contender on Aussie.com. You write a weekly column for the Amsterdam News, and you are quoted, at least in the New York City tabloids, about politics all of the time because I read those articles obsessively and I see your name all the time. So, Dr. Christina Greer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Sure. I guess first thing is just to get out of the way, the book prize. So, one, thank you again for joining our jury. Why'd you say yes to us?
Well, first things first, Howard's wife is one of my favorite New Yorkers, but that's besides the point. I love this city, and I always tell people when they ask me, I have my fingers in a lot of different pots, but I'm like, I love two things, cities and Black people. And this city in particular has so much. I think we can talk about so many issues that I'm interested in through the lens of New York. So we can talk about not just race and class, but the environment. We can talk about architecture and historical architecture. We can talk about, how water works or doesn't work. Thinking about some of the, podcasts we've done where I'm telling people to, test their water and the great sort of infrastructure that Michael Bloomberg built during his tenure as mayor. And really thinking about how leadership styles, plural, affect the way 9 million people get to live. I'm just fascinated by all those intricacies. So when Howard broached this idea about not just nonfiction books, but also fiction books, that really sparked my interest because there has been such beautiful writing about this complicated city. I mean, you can read a novel about Harlem, which is totally different than reading a novel about Wall Street, which is completely different than reading a novel about, someone growing up in Staten Island. So that's part of the reason why I chose it. And also just to meet other interesting New Yorkers who care about the city as much as I do.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting jury. Have you read anything so far this year that you think might be something that you're going to want to nominate for the prize?
I haven't, not just yet. I'm in a book group with my niece and my sister. My niece is in high school and we try and read her books together. So once I get through those and our little family book group, then I'll really start chipping away at some New York work.
Yeah, and then we're sending each juror, I think, 4 books in the coming week or so. So Deacon King Kong by James McBride, The City We Became by N.K. Jesmond, Weather by Jenny O'Fill, and The Index of Self-Destructive Acts by a guy whose name I'm forgetting, but the book was good. Christopher Bear, I think is his name. So you'll have four books on the way in whatever format you like it in. So Howard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm curious, Christina. What's your favorite book or books about New York? If somebody were coming to the city for the first time or interested in learning about New York, what would you recommend?
I might say Brown Girl, Brownstone by Paul Marshall. It's about Brooklyn, written by an African-American woman. I believe she wrote it in I think it was first published in 1959. There's a book I read many years ago that I've been trying to hunt down. It was a novel, but a historical fiction I think it was called The City. I can't remember. I picked it up from Book Culture, which was then Labyrinth near Columbia University.
Yep.
Grad school. And, from like the discount bin. And the central character's name was a formerly enslaved African named Cuffy. And I want to say it was called The City. I don't know, but I've been trying to track down this book for years. I mean, the problem is when I read good books, I immediately give them to a friend to read. And I don't necessarily keep a good list.
Right, and do you guys find that you have only basically bad books by good writers at home because you give all the good ones? This happens to me all the time.
Well, I would say, Bradley, added to that list are all the books that I've purchased who are just waiting for me to read them. So
Yeah.
each time I bring new books in, I mean, I supported book culture when I lived on the Upper West Side for 20 years, and now I've been trying to order more books online from Black-owned bookstores during the time of COVID, just to make sure they don't go under. Um, but I have so many books, and each time I add new books to the shelf, I can feel them looking at me like, "Really, lady? I mean, would you mind just reading at least some of us before you add others?"
I
Um,
know.
so, so I would say, there's lots of, I love reading Langston Hughes poems about Harlem, just because I lived in that area for so long, and oftentimes he talks about streets that I'm familiar with. And I might actually say my one of my favorites is a novella by Richard Wright called Rite of Passage, and it's about Morningside Park and a robbery that happens there with some young teens. But the way he describes the park, um, it like I know that park quite well. I used to walk our dog in that park, and so I know every single stairwell and nook and cranny that he describes.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated that 50 some odd years later, the layout and the feel is quite similar.
Yeah, it's an amazing. I used to work at the Parks Department. That was my introduction to New York City government and politics. And I always thought Morningside Park is one of the most interesting parks in the city because it is physically incredibly beautiful. It has multiple kind of groups of users from different worlds, and then there are times where it really flourishes, and there are times it seems to almost reflect this
Yeah.
where the city is at any given moment really well.
Yes. Yes. And the topography of the park is quite odd, in the
Yeah,
sense that it's very steep. And sadly, it does have a history of crime in that park just because of the layout. And it has a recent history of crime in that park. And Rite of Passage talks about that in a very detailed way. But it's also beautifully written. I feel like people who write about New York, there's always like this love letter to New York. New York is always it's sort of like a Woody Allen film, if we're still talking about Woody Allen. But
I'm not sure you're allowed to, but try.
not sure who might have
We'll,
to
we'll,
edit
we'll allow it. All right.
that. But New York is always an additional character. But you can also tell it's for many authors, it's like it's their first love, even if they're talking about someone or something else. New York
Right.
is still the first love.
Totally, totally. So let's dive into our sort of mutual obsession, which is New York City politics. Handicap the mayor's race for us next year.
Oh my. Well, I think that we can go on a multitude of directions, and I think it depends on a few things. One, how this summer and next summer shake out with crime. Two, the results of the 2020 presidential election race. Uh, and three, how the economy is going. And so I think some New Yorkers are going to want a super social justice mayor who can sort of aggregate all three of those things. I think some people are going to want more of a law and order mayor. I think some people might want a Bloomberg-esque type mayor who comes in possibly without electoral experience, but can say, I can get the economy back on track. But I think the wild card for everything, for me at least, is ranked choice voting, which we've never had before. We don't have any PSAs to explain to voters what it is and how it works. And so I think campaigning is going to be quite interesting because you aren't going to be able to go to your particular neighborhood, solidify a base, and win that way, even possibly with a runoff if you don't make 40%. You're really going to have to build multiple coalitions in multiple boroughs because you want to be someone's first choice. And if not, you at least want to be their second or third choice. Now, what concerns me is that many people don't know what ranked choice voting is. We've never seen it on this scale. We've seen it, in smaller cities like Minneapolis. But what happens if people don't fully understand what it is, and some people use it and some people don't? So that's what's fascinating to me. And I mean, obviously, we have our typical cast of characters who are electeds who are looking to move up in the world. But I have a feeling we'll see some millionaires/billionaires jump in, and then some other folks who possibly had said they were going to sit on the sidelines and and are going to decide to throw their hat in the ring.
Yeah, I think that's probably. It's funny. I've talked to the three leading candidates, Eric, Scott, and Corey, and they're all convinced that ranked choice voting is really good for them. That's probably mathematically impossible, but all three of them feel strongly that it favors them, which is interesting. Howard, what do you think the race is going to look like next year?
Well, I'm curious what your take is on the elections that we just had. I mean, we had a huge. I'm not sure I would call it an upset because I think Elliot Engel in the Bronx was in trouble from the beginning, but we had an important transfer from Elliot Engel to the man who will be the new congressman from the Bronx, Mr. Bowman. We had a number of other um, uh, DSA-backed candidates, socialist candidates, win, I think, what could be called upsets in some assembly primaries. Do you think that as has been reported that the last election that we just had in our primaries in New York shows that the electorate is moving decisively to the left?
I don't necessarily know that the electorate is moving to the left. I would say that primary voters have been targeted in different ways. And so I think that for so long we saw incumbents who had their solidified base, they spoke to that small group of people, and that was enough to carry them over the finish line uh, every June. Because in so many districts across the city, the primary essentially is the election. They're running either unopposed in November, or there's a weak leaning candidate from the opposite party that really has no consequence. Um, I spend every election night with New York One, and we see the numbers that people are going to Albany with, sometimes 4,000, 5,000 votes. So I think there's been a real mobilization of some of these newer candidates, where they're not necessarily backed by unions or major entities, but they're doing the hard work, the sort of grassroots door knocking, and the organizing to talk to people who haven't been spoken to in decades, and essentially make an argument that says, here's an issue that you're concerned about. Has your elected official ever A, contacted you, or B, worked on this issue? So the heavy lifting is definitely there, because you have to get people registered and you have to get people to turn out. But it's really not that hard from a policy perspective, because so many voters have been ignored by incumbents who've been in office for 10, 20, 30 years in certain cases. So I see it as an interesting primary conversation. I don't know if districts have necessarily changed ideologically as much as certain reports have said.
I do wonder, though. Bradley asked you about the mayor's race. It strikes me that there is not yet an obvious candidate of the left um, who has emerged to run, and I sort of feel like, as you said, there are still some shoes left to drop here, and some candidates will get in who are not currently in because if I am, somebody who is in the socialist wing of the party, I think I look at the results of the last election and think that maybe there's an opportunity for me in the mayor's race, or certainly that there will be someone who I think advocates for that perspective in a more profound way than anybody currently in the field would.
Oh yeah, and I mean, also, we can't ever underestimate, sort of wealthy men waking up every morning and saying, "I should do this." So I mean, that's a real possibility. I mean, I think I'm fascinated by where we'll like. I'm curious as to where we will be, say July 27th, 2021, because if New Yorkers are still in the pain that they're in now, which is really, it's pretty extreme, and sadly I think it might get worse. So we're going to have hard conversation. We're going to have a candidate that can speak quite extensively about rent control and sort of paying back rent versus rent forgiveness, debt forgiveness. We're going to have conversations about mortgages. So obviously someone who understands how state and federal governments work in conjunction with the city government. We're going to have conversations about commercial real estate. No one wants New York to turn into a suburban mall where everything's either an Old Navy or Marshall's, a Target, and what's the other, Michael's. We still want some sort of authenticity. So how do we do that? Depending on who's in the White House, we need a friendly president who understands the plight of New Yorkers. Transportation obviously is going to be something huge since it's been systematically defunded. And although the mayor doesn't control the MTA, it needs to be someone who understands not just public transport, but how to work with the governor. That would be lovely in order to get
Good luck.
some transportation.
There's a lot of knowing laughter on this end of the of this conversation.
But it's like ferries aren't going to cut it, and so we need someone who can see a 360-degree multidimensional space. And even if they're not an expert in that space, I think I had a lot of critiques of Bloomberg, don't get me wrong, but I did feel like he hired people who actually understood their positions, and he listened to them. Whereas, I think de Blasio actually has hired really good people. Whether or not he listens to them or not, I think that's always been where the rubber hits the road, and I have problems with the mayor.
Yeah, they would at least say in private he does not.
Right. And so it's like, what's the point of having qualified people around them if you think you're the smartest person in the room? So I'm very curious. Obviously there's some demographics, there's only been one African-American mayor in the history of New York City. We're on 109 mayors. We've had 0 female mayors, but, Chicago has had 2. Obviously, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, major cities Atlanta have had female mayors. They've actually had female mayors of color. So I'm curious as to how that will be a conversation. Now that Ruben Diaz Jr. has said he's not only not running, but he's packing up his bags and leaving politics altogether, what does that mean for the Latinx community in New York? Who will be their candidate? And we understand that these groups are not monolithic, but, I was interested in John Liu's run in 2013 and sort of some of the progressive ideas that he had, but he wasn't able to build a coalition that sort of put him in the front. I'm fascinated by the 2013 race. For me, next year, with basically 2/3 of city council, the big 3 races, the borough president races up for grabs. Next year for me as a political scientist is essentially like Christmas, Hanukkah, like you name it.
No Kwanzaa?
Yes, exactly. Like seriously, you go down the list, add them all up and multiply them. Like I don't sleep the night before an election. It's basically, I'm like 6 years old again. It's like Christmas Eve. I can't wait. Like I have butterflies in my stomach. It's just a level of excitement. But I'm also praying that we still have a democracy to actually participate in.
Yeah.
Like depending on what happens on November 3rd of this year will largely dictate what happens next year.
Like playing baseball? Did pretty good on your high school team? Still have that old mitt somewhere? That's good enough for us. Come try it for the Miami Marlins this Thursday at 3 p.m. in the small parking lot next to the Publix in Hialeah. To be clear, not the big parking lot that's being used for mass pandemic testing. Sure, we've lost 15 guys to COVID so far, but their illness could be your opportunity to make it to the big leagues. So if you think you've got what it takes to hit a 97 per mile hour fastball and withstand a constant barrage of highly contagious viruses, try it for the Miami Marlins. Other than your life, you've really got nothing to lose. So yeah, that's the thing. Because Christina, you laid out. I think it's funny when you talk about the some billionaire will run. They all seem to call me for when they think that they should be mayor. And the other day, I found myself giving the exact same set of criteria, which is if Biden wins, temperature goes way down, right? If Trump somehow gets reelected, I think the most sort of woke progressive candidate definitely, is the favorite. And then you have these variables of, do we have a vaccine? Where's the economy? Where is crime? How bad have things gotten under de Blasio? And then all of that will really determine whether there's an opening for a non-traditional candidate, right? Like Mike ran obviously before 9/11, but wouldn't have come even close absent 9/11, right? That's what created the opening for him. But if you guys kind of had to weigh all of this and say, what would be the right kind of set of circumstances that would allow someone other than a borough president, a controller, someone like that we already have, to seriously compete? What's the environment?
Well, I really think that November 3rd, 2020 has a huge, like that reach is so large on New York City. And I really do think that the economy plays a huge role. I mean, I was trying to explain to my students what you want to happen and what you think will happen are oftentimes not congruent. So, like, keep your eye on the prize. I I'm really concerned with in this moment if we find ourselves in November of 2021 with a candidate who's just all about money. Like, let's focus on the economy. I don't think that that's the strategy we should employ. Lately, I was just talking to some folks about how during COVID you text people at inappropriate hours that were once inappropriate. Now it's like texting someone at 3 a.m. is just totally normal. But I was texting some journalist friends of mine, and I said, I think that the next mayor possibly should have some electoral experience, even if it's really minor, just because I'm thinking that this person will really need to work with like Albany, with the governor, with people from Congress in a way that we've never seen before. I'm still trying to sift through whether or not that's a solidified position of mine, but I'm starting to lean in that direction just because I think that we might want someone who understands the legislative process because they're going to have to do some things pretty quickly and work with people at varying levels of government.
That assumes something that seems to me extremely optimistic, which is that Cuomo will be willing to work with anybody who wins that seat cooperatively.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Cuomo's raised in captivity, so I mean, he's trying to figure out what he wants to do. Um, I think Cuomo will just be so happy to work with someone not de Blasio. We at least have a small window of maybe 3 months where he'll be on his best behavior. Um, Now, I could be giving him way too much credit, but
Yeah, no. Well, look, I mean, Howard, I think I mean you were deputy mayor when this happened, but Cuomo, while probably not personally Mike's biggest fan, at least sort of feared the Bloomberg political might enough to occasionally try to cooperate. Um, do you think there's some world where the next mayor has some other blend that keeps Cuomo at least somewhat on the field?
I think it's interesting. The my sense is that the new mayor gets a mandate or a perceived mandate to do something in Albany, because as we all know, much of what the mayor wants to do, any mayor would want to do, has to go through Albany, to the great frustration of mayors. Mike was able to get control of the schools. He ran on that. Uh, and he had a perceived mandate to do that and was able to get that through Albany, despite the fact that there had been a lot of resistance to that. De Blasio ran on universal pre-K and was able to sort of get that through, although not exactly in the form that he wanted it, but he was able to get a version of it through Albany. And so the advice that I have given to people who have reached out to me who are thinking of running for mayor is that think about what issue you run on and make your centerpiece, because it may be that the one thing that you're able to get through Albany because you will be perceived to have had a mandate to do it. And I think one of the challenges that de Blasio had with the second term is that he didn't do that when he was running for the second term. He didn't really run on anything in particular. And so I don't think anybody in Albany perceived that he had a mandate to do anything in particular in the second term. And I think that has hurt him. I mean, I think you always want to go in to Albany with some sense that the public is on your side. And even then you may not get what you want, but it's hard to get it without that as a mayor, as a new mayor, or as a mayor who is elected to a second term.
well, it's interesting, Howard, because I agree with you 110%. I mean, I break up De Blasio's tenure into 4 quarters. So the first was when he, first term, first half, come in, universal pre-K, sort of progressive rhetoric. Uh, First term, second half, sort of still riding the wave of pre-K, not really stop and frisk, but that's pretty much it. And then preparing himself to run for the second term, and not really having a challenger, which I thought was, I mean, I didn't count Sal Albanese as a challenger in the way that I would have counted someone like a borough president or a sitting elected. And then the second term first half, we're gallivanting in Iowa and anything but New York City. And now we have second term second half where the mayor has to focus, but doesn't really have goodwill in the reserve. And it seems as though his interest level is possibly coming back, but now we have a global pandemic and not really a foundation of people who feel like you've been working with them or for them for the past, say, 4 years, because there hasn't really been a mandate in the city or in Albany to get anything done.
Okay, this is a message sponsored by your local elected officials. I'll just read it to you. On behalf of the incumbent congressman, state senator, governor, state assemblywoman, city council member, county clerk, and all 6 circuit court judges in your district, please don't bother to vote this November. You have plenty to do already, streaming the Jeffrey Epstein documentary on Netflix, looking up from your phone to yell at your kids to get off Instagram and stop playing Fortnite, knitting masks for at-risk driver's ed teachers. You've got enough on your plate already, so this November 3rd, don't worry about it. Stay home, relax, everything's fine. Hey, Christina, before we wrap up, tell us a little about your kind of current work. I know you're doing a history of all African Americans who have run for executive office in the U.S. Tell us kind of what you're studying these days, what you're writing, what you're thinking about.
Yeah, so, for anyone who's ever written a book, you all know that it's, a Sisyphean task. Right now, I've put my long-term projects on pause and am focusing on saving the democracy. So I've been
probably was, yeah.
I was like, let's just prioritize. I'm going to reshuffle some things. So I put the book on pause, and I'm writing, lots of op-eds about, who Biden should choose and what's actually happening with coronavirus, and trying to help people walk through, why I'm so concerned about the future of American democracy. Obviously, I have lots of critiques of this nation. However, I mean, the direction we're going is not sustainable, and we can look to other countries. I'm not a comparativist, but we can look to other countries to see what our future looks like if we continue on this path. And so helping people understand, what the framers intended, but also how the two-party system is and is not working right now. So that's one of the main projects. I mainly work on, cities and Black folks when I write. So in addition to the book about the history of all African Americans who have run for the presidency, essentially from like Frederick Douglass to Barack Obama, I've done some work about sort of Black female leadership. So I'm fascinated about the intersection of race and gender in an executive role, and how some people really struggle with the intersection of those two. And I'm sort of outlining a book project about Stacey Abrams' run for governor in 2018, especially since Georgia is the South, it's the Deep South, but it's increasingly becoming more purple, and what that means for coalition building in an electoral space when you're trying to win statewide, because we don't have a long history of Black women statewide. We've never had a Black female governor in the history of our nation, and we've only had 2 Black female elected senators. That's Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois and Kamala Harris of California. So Black women statewide have not been seen as leaders. And so what does that mean in a 21st century conversation?
Do you imagine that Joe Biden will pick an African American woman to be VP? And if so, what do you think the reaction will be to that?
I think that he's sort of teed himself up for that decision. I think the sort of easy decision would obviously be Senator Harris. I don't know if that's the wisest decision. I actually know that's not the wisest decision. I think that, there are going to be a lot of Democrats, obviously, who they won't care who he chooses, because they just need Donald Trump out of office. I think some will really be looking to the number 2 ticket because Biden is 77, and because they are going to assume that he's really going to rely on his VP, not just traveling and representation, but as someone who's a strategic partner. And now I think, as we've seen, white mothers and grandmothers being tear gassed and beaten in cities in the Pacific Northwest, I think that some sort of weak-leaning Democrats, independent/moderates, and possibly even weak-leaning Republicans are going to be more interested in not just Joe Biden, but who he chooses. And if he chooses a woman, I think that will actually spark some interest in some folks who possibly weren't interested maybe just a few weeks ago.
Who would you advise him to pick if he asked you?
Stacey Abrams, full stop. Like, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. I mean, I think sadly it's because people, because she's not a sitting elected. And I mean, I studied that race quite closely. I mean, if I ever saw grift, that's like a classic case of stolen election by a Secretary of State who's also running against you. But, I think what she was able to do in the state house with Republican white male Southerners is a masterclass in sort of LBJ style politics of like knowing the rules and building coalitions sometimes with people who are your polar opposite to get legislation passed or stopped. So strategically, I think she understands the legislative process and is really interested in like the one. I mean, she'll tell you she's a nerd. But LBJ is my favorite president, and studying LBJ, what made him so successful as a president was because he knew every single rule of the Senate and the House. So he could get things passed, i.e. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Immigration Act, because he knew not just the players. I mean, that's important, and you can do that. But knowing the rules is actually what helps you build coalitions and massage the process to get what you want. And also, I really think that Biden needs someone who helps him with the campaign process and the governance process. I think all the women who were on the list will be just fine in governance. I don't think that any of them, I don't have a doubt about that. The problem is we need someone who can campaign, especially in this awkward space that we're in, online. And it's very clear that, certain women resonate with voters and certain women don't. And we saw that during, the presidential primary. And so I think Stacey has governance down pat, even if sort of people can't see it because they don't want to see it. I mean, if a white man had her CV, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But I think the campaigning piece is so important because we don't want to, Tim Kaine ourselves, where it's like, yeah, you'd be great, after November 8th, but guess what? You didn't help us get to November 8th.
I'm not sure anyone listening to this podcast except the three of us could even identify who Tim Kaine is.
We're in a lineup. Like, so I think you have to make sure that you have someone who's helpful in the campaigning phase and the governance phase. It can't just be this assumption that you're going to win Joe Biden because, Mike Dukakis was up by these numbers and we see where that went. And we also know there's a level of calm that the Republicans have that makes me very nervous with these polls. And so we've seen them cheat several times in the past few years. So the fact that they're not freaking out and, people are like, oh, they are. It's like, no, they're actually not the way that they should be. And they're not changing their behavior, which lets me know that they're pretty confident that at the polls, they can do enough to make sure that the margins are in their favor, whether it's voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement, voter intimidation, or just straight up theft, which we saw a little bit in Florida and a lot in Georgia in 2018, or, Russian interference, which we definitely saw in 2016.
So let me wrap up then with the question for each of you. Two questions about Biden for each of you. So this is on the assumption that he does win and is not cheated out of the presidency. One is, Christina, you talked about LBJ being such a master of the Senate that he was able to push things through that other presidents can't. Biden would be really the first real kind of long-term senator since LBJ to win. Obviously, Obama was in the Senate, but just for a couple of years, kind of had some
disdain. Longer than Obama.
Yeah, and kind of had disdain for the body, which I can't blame him. But so one is, do the two of you think that will be an effective tool by Biden, or has the world just changed so much that it just doesn't matter and you can't work with the other side? And second, there's always this assumption, at least in conversations that I have with people, that part of the reason the VP pick is so important is because she will likely be the nominee in 2024. History does not show that people give up power so easily. So if Biden is still alive, is it safe to assume he's only going to want to serve one term?
I'll tackle that last part first. I mean, No, people don't give up power easily, but Biden will be 82 and running for the presidency. And I think that someone, hopefully in his inner circle, will say, and, I don't want to sound ageist, but it's like, spend some time with your grandkids. I mean, for Pete's sake, like, well, even if the country is going well, like, settle down, and also it's like, it's really important to pass the baton. I mean, that's been part of the problem. We saw it in Harlem for years. If you stay in the seat too long, you're not cultivating younger talent and setting the party up for the future. I think Biden has enough respect for the party and the country to step aside. So I actually do think that if he's elected, he will serve one term and then step aside. As far as his background in the Senate, I don't know if it works in the same way as LBJ. I don't think that it's a negative asset by any stretch of the imagination, but we do know that these Republicans have been calcified in their dedication, loyalty, and sort of sycophantic nature to Donald Trump. We'll see if there's some wiggle room if Donald Trump is no longer in office, if they grow a spine overnight and decide that they want to represent the American people and their party in a respectful way in ways that they have not done thus far. So that remains to be seen. I mean, the way that the president has been able to intimidate people in his own party, I mean, using Jeff Sessions as an example, has really kept them in line for him in such a succinct manner. So I don't know what their behavior will be once Trump is gone. Will they finally have a voice and pretend that the 4 years of abusing American people never happened?
Howard, what do you think?
I think some of it depends on assuming that Biden wins, the size of his victory. I think if it's narrow or relatively narrow, the forces of obstruction will, I think, remain strong on the Republican side because he will not be perceived to have won any significant mandate, and I don't think it will be perceived as a significant repudiation of what the Republicans have done. But if he wins a big victory and the Democrats, take the Senate, at least partially as a result, maybe you have some kind of reckoning among Republicans that, the last 4 years was something of a mistake and that maybe there are some things that Democrats and Republicans can do together. I realize that sounds maybe a little naive, but I do think it will depend somewhat on how, if he wins, what his margin is and the perception of how successful he was. I mean, you are beginning to hear now some discussion among political experts that the Democrats have a decent chance of taking the Senate, which is not something that anyone would have necessarily predicted at the beginning of this cycle, other than Chuck Schumer. And if Biden wins a big enough victory and Democrats take the Senate, I think the Republicans will have an awful lot of soul searching to engage in. Whether or not they do it or not, I suppose, will be an open question.
Yeah, I think that soul searching is one way to put it, and possibly truth and reconciliation is another way.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Will you guys come back on after the election in November so we can go see where we're right and wrong and what happens next?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Christina Greer, Howard Wolfson, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.